Little Laramie River Valley, Wyoming Territory, 1876. While every homesteader raced to throw up the fastest, cheapest cabin before winter, one Norwegian stone mason was still laying out a perfect circle with a stake and rope. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Anders Krogstad spent an entire summer building walls 24 inches thick, twice what anyone thought necessary, forming a stone cylinder 24 feet across with a conical roof. They built 14 by 18 frame cabins in 6 weeks. He took 4 months on what they mocked as the lighthouse without a light and the silo he forgot to fill. Then January 9th, 1887 arrived. The great die-up blizzard hit with 20 below zero temperatures and 60-mile-per-hour winds. Standard rectangular cabins groaned and leaked, their interiors dropping near freezing. But that fool's round stone house, it held steady at 50 degrees while families huddled inside, sleeping in shirt sleeves. What did this immigrant understand about wind, stone, and circles that every other frontier builder missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Anders Krogstad had learned his trade laying up coastal stone in western Norway, where North Sea gales could strip thatch from a roof in minutes, and where the old builders knew that corners caught wind like nets caught fish. When he filed his homestead claim under the Homestead Act in the spring of 1876, he carried more than the usual immigrant's bundle of tools and dreams. 3 summers working the Missouri River country had shown him earth lodges, circular, earth-bermed homes where Mandan and Hidatsa families sat comfortable while prairie wind scoured the open ground above their roofs. The 160 acres he claimed lay in a gentle swale where the Little Laramie River curved through grassland, sheltered enough for hay but open enough to catch the relentless westerlies that defined Wyoming weather. While his neighbors walked their property lines calculating board feet and window placement, Anders drove a stake at the center of a level spot and tied on 30 feet of rope. The circle he scribed in the prairie sod measured 24 feet across, enough floor space for a family, guests, and the heavy central chimney he envisioned. His wife ran her hand along the curved line he'd marked and asked how they would set furniture against walls with no straight edges. Anders pointed toward a grove of cottonwoods where the wind split and rejoined around each trunk. "The wind goes around," he said in his careful English. "Square house, it hits like a fist. Round house, like water around a stone." The foundation required moving more earth than his neighbors thought sensible. Anders dug down 3 feet, creating a circular trench that would anchor walls designed to carry enormous weight. Local sandstone quarried from cuts along the river came in blocks weighing 60 to 80 pounds each, dense enough to test a strong man's back but light enough for one man handling. The stone ran roughly 140 pounds per cubic foot, meaning the completed walls would hold over 100 tons of mass around the perimeter. A heat battery that would warm slowly and cool slowly, fighting the temperature swings that made thin-walled cabins miserable. By midsummer, with the walls rising past head height, the mockery had settled into reliable patterns. Jim Talbot, whose family ran cattle on the open range south of the valley, made regular inspections that always ended with the same jokes. "Building a fort for a war that ain't coming," he'd tell whoever would listen at the trading post. "Man spends that much time on one room, he ought to be adding a second story or a proper parlor." The criticism that stung came from practical concerns that Anders could not easily dismiss. Sarah Nevin, whose husband operated a weigh station for freight wagons, visited during a July afternoon when the stone walls stood 12 feet high. She walked the interior perimeter, noting how the curve would force any better cabinet to sit several inches from the wall. "You'll have cold air underneath every piece of furniture," she observed. "And how do you hang shelves level when nothing's plumb?" Anders had answers drawn from his months among the Missouri River people, though he struggled to explain them in terms his neighbors would accept. The Earth Lodge families hung storage from central posts, or built low benches that followed the wall's curve. They banked their fires in the center where smoke would rise straight up, not against an outside wall where heat would leak through chinking. But these explanations sounded like foreign superstition to homesteaders bent on recreating the frame houses they remembered from Ohio or Pennsylvania. The wall construction followed principles Anders had learned from his father, adapted for the harsher climate and available materials. At the base, the stone lay 24 inches thick, each course carefully leveled and chinked with smaller fragments and lime mortar mixed with prairie clay. As the walls rose, he tapered them inward, reaching 18 inches thick at the point where the roof timbers would bear. The technique required constant attention to the curve, checking radius and plumb with string lines radiating from the central stake like spokes of a wheel. Through August and September, while neighbors completed their rectangular cabins and began cutting winter firewood, Anders shaped window openings that curved with the wall. 2 windows faced south to catch winter sun, each measuring 2 feet by 3 feet, large enough for light but small enough to minimize heat loss. A single smaller window looked east toward the sunrise. The north wall, which would face the prevailing winter storms, remained solid, stone except for the carefully planned door opening. The door itself required more thought than neighbors understood. Rather than cutting straight through the thick wall, Anders created a short passage that turned 90 degrees once inside, a dogleg entry that would stop wind from blowing directly into the living space. He had seen similar wind baffles in earth lodge entrances, where families built interior walls specifically to defeat the prairie gales that could extinguish fires and freeze water buckets in minutes. By late September, with the stone walls complete and the roof timbers cut from local pine, Anders began the work that would define his house's performance through decades of Wyoming winters. He hauled earth up around the exterior walls, creating a berm that rose 3 feet on the north and west sides, where the prevailing storms would hit hardest. The berming followed patterns he had observed in earth lodge construction, where families routinely banked their homes with tons of sod and earth that served as both insulation and wind deflection. The conical roof, framed at a 45-degree pitch, would shed wind like the teepees he had seen among traveling bands of Cheyenne and Arapaho. Local lumber merchants shook their heads at the waste of having no flat roof for storage or expansion, but Anders had watched enough Wyoming storms to know that any surface that caught wind would eventually surrender to it. The roof sheathing went on tight, covered with hand-split shingles arranged in overlapping courses that would turn water and snow without creating the flat planes and sharp edges that gave wind something to grab. As October snow began dusting the high ridges, Anders lit his first fire in the massive central chimney he had built from the same local stone as the walls. The interior temperature climbed steadily and held, the thick walls storing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. His neighbors, watching smoke rise straight from the conical roof with no sideways drift or backdraft, began asking different questions about the man they had called a fool for spending an entire building season on a single room. The winter of 1878 arrived with the punctuality that defined Wyoming weather. Early November snow followed by steady cold that would hold until March. Anders Krogstad's first season in the round stone house provided the kind of comparative data that frontier families rarely had luxury to gather, since survival typically left little time for measurement and record-keeping. Jim Talbot's rectangular cabin, built with 14-inch pine logs chinked with clay and moss, followed the standard pattern that had served homesteaders from the Ohio Valley to the Oregon Territory. The structure measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with windows facing south and east for morning light, and a stone chimney built against the north wall to save interior space. On a typical December night, with outsides, temperatures holding steady around 15 degrees and wind gusting to 25 miles per hour, the interior temperature near the floor rarely climbed above 35 degrees unless the fire was stoked to a roar that consumed cordwood at an alarming rate. The problem lay not just in the thin walls, though 14 inches of pine provided far less thermal mass than Anders's 24 inches of stone. The rectangular shape created pressure differentials that plagued every similar cabin in the valley. When northwest wind hit the broad face of Talbot's cabin, it created high pressure against that wall and suction at the trailing corners that literally pulled warm air from the interior. Chinking gaps that seemed tight during construction opened under this pressure, allowing streams of cold air to flow along the floor while heated air escaped through the eaves. Inside the round stone house, during the same December nights, conditions told a different story. The curved walls presented no broad face to catch the full force of prevailing winds. Instead, the airflow split and rejoined, creating relatively even pressure around the perimeter. With the same size heating stove burning similar fuel, the interior temperature at head height held steady around 50 degrees, while the floor temperature near the walls measured 40 to 42 degrees, cold enough to require warm clothing, but well above the freezing point that made water buckets and washing impossible in neighboring cabins. The fuel consumption numbers provided the clearest measure of each building's performance. Talbot estimated his winter consumption at close to 5 cords of mixed wood and buffalo chips, dried bison dung that had become the standard heating fuel across much of the treeless prairie. The chips burned hot but fast, requiring constant attention and frequent trips to the fuel pile during the coldest nights. Neighbors who lacked access to adequate wood supplies often burned 4 to 6 cords worth of equivalent fuel, sometimes mixing in twisted hay or anything else that would sustain combustion. Anders's family, maintaining comfortable conditions in the round stone house, used approximately 3.5 cords worth of equivalent fuel through the same winter period. The 30% reduction came not from superior fuel or more efficient combustion, but from the building's ability to retain heat once generated. The thick stone walls absorbed warmth during active firing periods and released it slowly over hours, moderating the temperature swings that forced other families to choose between freezing and exhausting their fuel supplies. The most telling proof came during a late winter storm that brought sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and driving snow that found every gap in conventional construction. Inside Talbot's cabin, lamplight flickered constantly as drafts moved through the structure, and fine snow accumulated on window sills despite closed shutters. The U family spent the night huddled near the fire, feeding it continuously to maintain any warmth at floor level. Anders, checking his own house during the same storm, found conditions that seemed to defy the weather outside. A candle placed near the curved wall burned with barely a flicker, demonstrating how effectively the round shape shed wind pressure. The interior temperature dropped only a few degrees from its normal range, and the family slept comfortably in the loft where the rising warm air collected under the conical roof. These early demonstrations drew mixed reactions from neighbors who had invested their reputations in conventional wisdom. Sarah Nevin, whose initial skepticism had given way to careful observation, began adopting small modifications that showed Anders's influence. She convinced her husband to add an interior baffle wall near their front door, creating a crude airlock that reduced drafts. The improvement was noticeable but could not address the fundamental problems of corner leakage and inadequate thermal mass that affected the basic rectangular structure. Others remained committed to their original criticism, attributing Anders's success to factors that preserved their own building philosophy. "He's got better stone," Talbot insisted after visiting during a January cold snap. "Quarry stone holds heat different than what we can haul." The explanation allowed neighbors to acknowledge the roundhouse's performance without admitting that shape and mass were doing work that their own designs could not match. More telling were the quiet adoptions that began appearing around the valley. One family moved their heating stove from against the outside wall to a more central position, improving heat distribution. Another began banking earth around the north side of their cabin, creating a partial windbreak that reduced fuel consumption. These modifications fell short of Anders's integrated approach, but demonstrated that his methods were yielding results too obvious to ignore completely. The seasonal pattern established during that first winter would repeat with variations over the next several years. Each cold season provided fresh examples of the round stone house's superior performance, measured in fuel saved, comfort maintained, and the simple ability to function normally when conventional cabins became barely habitable. The thick walls continued storing and releasing heat in daily cycles that moderated temperature swings, while the aerodynamic shape shed wind pressure that tested every corner and joint of rectangular construction. By 1885, as another building season approached, Anders had acquired a reputation that balanced respect with persistent mockery. His fuel savings were undeniable, his comfort levels envied, and his construction methods increasingly studied by neighbors who remained unwilling to abandon the rectangular tradition that defined proper housing in their minds. The round stone house had proven itself through normal winters, but the real test was coming. The summer of 1886 broke records across the northern plains in ways that old-timers would discuss for decades. Temperatures climbed into the 90s week after week, with rainfall so sparse that the Little Laramie River dropped to levels not seen in living memory. Grass that should have stood knee-high by July barely reached a man's ankles, and what growth existed had been cropped to the roots by cattle numbers that had swollen beyond the land's capacity to support them. The open-range system that had made fortunes for territorial ranchers depended on abundant grass and mild winters, but 1886 was testing both assumptions. Jim Talbot, whose cattle operation had expanded to over 800 head, watched his animals competing for forage on ranges that had supported half that number in previous years. Prairie fires, sparked by lightning or careless campfires, swept across ridges already stripped bare, leaving expanses of blackened earth that would provide no winter shelter for livestock or wildlife. Through these conditions, Anders Krogstad observed signs that his neighbors dismissed as coincidence or superstition. In late August, when migrating birds should have been gathering for their usual September departure, flocks of geese and cranes were already moving south in numbers that seemed premature. Beaver along the river worked with unusual intensity, cutting willows and banking their dams higher than he had seen in previous years. Even the domestic animals seemed affected. Horses grew thicker coats earlier, and cattle bunched together in low areas rather than spreading across the available range. The clearest warnings came from Bear by the River, an elderly Arapaho man who occasionally stopped at homesteads to trade or share news from the reservation. During a September visit, he studied the sky and wind patterns with the attention of someone whose survival had once depended on reading such signs accurately. "Cold winter coming," he told Anders in careful English. "Animals know, birds know, white men, they don't watch." He gestured toward the round stone house with approval. "Earth house. Good. Like the old people made. Wind goes around." Anders had learned to trust such observations during his years in Missouri River country, where native families had perfected winter survival through centuries of experience with prairie conditions. Their earth lodges, some measuring 60 feet across and housing extended families through the harshest months, represented engineering solutions developed long before European settlement brought rectangular construction and thin-wall building techniques to the high plains. Acting on these accumulated warnings, Anders began modifications to his house that seemed excessive to neighbors who had not learned to read environmental signs. He spent 3 weeks in September hauling additional earth to raise the berms, around his north and west walls from 3 feet to 4.5 feet, a change that would add significant thermal mass and wind protection during severe weather. The extra 18 inches of earth represented several tons of additional material that would help moderate interior temperatures and deflect wind pressure. More significantly, he added a second door system that created a proper airlock entry. The modification required building an interior wall that divided the existing dogleg passage, creating 2 separate doors with a small chamber between them. The design followed principles he had observed in earth lodge construction, where families routinely created multiple barriers against wind infiltration. During severe storms, the airlock would prevent cold air from rushing directly into the living space each time someone entered or left the house. Anders also modified the fresh air supply to his heating system, running a small duct from outside directly to the area near his stove. The improvement would eliminate the need to crack windows or doors for combustion air during extreme cold, preventing the drafts that plagued conventional cabins where families had to choose between adequate oxygen for their fires and protection from freezing air currents. His fuel stockpiling efforts drew the most visible criticism from neighbors who saw such preparation as wasteful or pessimistic. While most families aimed for 3 to 4 cords worth of mixed wood and buffalo chips, enough for a typical Wyoming winter, Anders accumulated nearly 6 cords equivalent, a 50% increase that required significant additional labor and storage space. He cut and split wood through early October, continuing long after his neighbors had declared their winter preparations complete. Jim Talbot responded to the same environmental signs by doubling down on expansion rather than preparation. He invested in a larger rectangular bunkhouse that would accommodate 12 men during winter months, betting that his cattle operation would continue growing despite the overgrazed conditions. The new structure followed conventional design principles, thin walls, large windows, and minimal attention to wind resistance, representing a philosophy that trusted in normal weather patterns and rapid economic growth. Sarah Nevin's family made similar calculations, adding a half story to their existing frame cabin to create additional living space. The modification increased the building's wind exposure and added joints and connections that would be tested by severe weather, but it provided the extra room needed for their growing household. Like most frontier families, they optimized for normal conditions rather than worst-case scenarios. The first clear signs of an abnormal winter appeared in early November when snow fell 2 weeks ahead of the usual schedule and in quantities that suggested the beginning of a severe season. More ominous were the weather patterns that followed repeated cycles of Chinook winds that brought temporary thaws, followed by sudden freezes that created ice layers over the existing snow. These conditions would prove deadly for livestock, creating crust that prevented animals from reaching grass beneath, but most ranchers interpreted the early storms as isolated events rather than harbingers of systematic failure. By late November, with temperatures already dropping well below normal ranges and snow accumulating in drifts that would not melt until spring, Anders completed his final preparations. His house stood ready for conditions that most neighbors still believed would moderate according to historical patterns. The round stone structure, with its enhanced thermal mass, improved air sealing, and aerodynamic shape, represented the kind of systematic preparation that native communities had practiced for generations. The coming months would test whether such preparation remained relevant in an age of cattle fortunes and conventional wisdom. The blizzard that would define the Great Die-Up winter struck the Little Laramie Valley on January 9, 1887, arriving with the violence that characterized the worst storms in Wyoming history. Weather records from military posts across the territory would later document winds sustained at 50 to 60 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70, driving snow that reduced visibility to zero and creating drifts that buried entire buildings. Temperatures plunged to 25 below zero and held there for days, testing every structure and survival strategy across the northern plains. Jim Talbot's rectangular bunkhouse, designed to shelter 12 men through normal winter conditions, revealed its fundamental weaknesses within hours of the storm's arrival. The broad west face of the building caught the full force of the northwest wind like a sail, creating pressure that strained every joint and connection. High pressure against that wall combined with suction at the trailing corners to create airflow patterns that literally pulled chinking from between the logs. Gaps that had seemed adequately sealed during construction opened under the relentless wind pressure, allowing streams of frigid air to flow across the floor while heated air escaped through any available opening near the ceiling. Inside the bunkhouse, men huddled around a heating stove that glowed red from continuous firing yet could not raise the interior temperature above the mid-30s. Water buckets froze solid despite being positioned near the fire, and fine snow accumulated on bunks as wind-driven particles found their way through gaps in the log construction. The men took turns feeding fuel to the stove throughout the night, burning through their carefully hoarded supply at a rate that would exhaust their reserves within days if the storm continued. Sarah Nevin's frame cabin, with its recent half-story addition, suffered even more dramatic failures. The increased wall area and additional joints created by the expansion provided more surfaces for wind to exploit. On the second night of the storm, a window shattered under flying debris, and despite desperate efforts to cover the opening with blankets and boards, the breach could not be sealed against the hurricane-force winds. Snow accumulated inside the cabin faster than the family could remove it, and the interior temperature dropped toward the freezing point, despite continuous firing of their heating stove. The round stone house, by contrast, demonstrated the engineering principles that Anders had incorporated based on traditional designs proven over centuries of prairie winters. The curved walls presented no broad face for the wind to strike, causing the airflow to split and rejoin around the cylindrical structure like water flowing around a boulder. This aerodynamic advantage eliminated the pressure differentials that plagued rectangular buildings, where high pressure on one side and suction on the other created the driving forces that opened gaps and pulled heated air from interiors. The technical measurements that Anders recorded during the storm's peak revealed the dramatic difference that shape and mass could make. With outside temperatures holding at 25 below zero and winds averaging 55 miles per hour, the interior temperature at chest height remained steady between 48 and 52 degrees. Even more remarkably, the temperature at floor level against the thick stone walls measured 38 to 40 degrees, cold enough to require warm clothing, but well above the freezing point that made normal activities impossible in neighboring structures. The fuel consumption inside the round house increased to approximately 1.5 wheelbarrows of wood per day compared to the single wheelbarrow used during normal cold weather, but this represented manageable consumption that could be sustained for weeks rather than the desperate overfiring required in failing rectangular cabins. The thick stone walls continued their thermal battery function, absorbing heat during active firing periods and releasing it gradually, maintaining relatively stable conditions even when the fire died down to coals. By the third day of the storm, the bunkhouse had become uninhabitable. Ice formed on interior walls despite continuous heating, and several men showed early signs of frostbite from sleeping in conditions that hovered near the freezing point. Jim Talbot made the decision to evacuate, leading his men on a desperate trek across 300 yards of open ground, where visibility remained near zero, and wind speeds threatened to knock grown men from their feet. The journey from the failing bunkhouse to the round stone house required nearly an hour to cover a distance normally walked in minutes. Talbot's group moved in single file, each man holding a rope that connected them to prevent anyone from becoming lost in the whiteout conditions that had claimed lives within yards of shelter across the storm-affected region. When they reached Anders's door, snow had drifted against the curved wall but had not created the dangerous cornices and pressure points that formed around rectangular buildings. Inside the round house, the addition of 12 extra people created crowded conditions but did not overwhelm the structure's thermal capacity. The central location of the heating stove and chimney meant that rising warm air circulated efficiently throughout the single large room before collecting under the conical roof, where it provided comfortable sleeping conditions in the loft area. The thick walls continued storing and releasing heat, moderating temperature swings even with the increased occupancy and frequent opening of the airlock doors. Over the following days, as word spread through the valley's scattered homesteads, other families made similar desperate journeys to the round stone house. Sarah Nevin's family arrived after their frame cabin became impossible to heat, bringing the total number of refugees to nearly 20 people crowded into the 450-square-foot interior. A single ranch hand caught in the open when the storm hit had survived 3 nights in a collapsed line shack before making his way to the only building in the valley that remained fully functional. The round house served as more than shelter during the week-long storm. Anders hung a lantern at the entry during brief lulls, creating a beacon that guided other survivors across the dangerous open ground. The building's performance under maximum stress demonstrated that traditional design principles, properly applied, could provide security that conventional frontier construction could not match. While cattle froze standing in the open and rectangular buildings failed across the territory, the lighthouse without a light had become the one structure that refused to surrender to the wind. When the spring thaw finally came in April of 1887, riders across the Wyoming Territory found landscapes that resembled battlefields more than ranching country. Cattle carcasses lay scattered across the prairie like driftwood after a flood, marking the sites where animals had sought shelter behind ridges or in creek bottoms before freezing where they stood. Estimates would eventually place the livestock losses between 50 and 80% across the northern plains, with some operations losing their entire herds to what historians would call the Great Die-Up. In the Little Laramie Valley, the inventory of damage revealed the precise cost of building philosophies tested under extreme conditions. Jim Talbot's rectangular bunkhouse had survived structurally, but bore evidence of the punishment it had endured: warped siding where wind pressure had flexed the frame, gaps around windows and doors that would require extensive rechinking, and a roof that sagged slightly where snow. Loads had stressed the conventional rafter system. His main cabin showed similar stress damage, with interior walls stained by moisture that had penetrated during the worst of the storm. Sarah Nevin's frame house required more extensive repairs. The broken window had allowed snow and ice to accumulate inside, warping floorboards and damaging furnishings that could not be easily replaced on the frontier. More significantly, the half-story addition had shifted slightly on its foundation, creating gaps and misalignments that would plague the family through future winters unless addressed with major reconstruction work. The round stone house, by contrast, showed minimal damage despite having sheltered nearly 20 people through the worst of the winter. A few shingles had blown from the conical roof, and frost action had opened hairline cracks in some of the mortar joints, but the fundamental structure remained sound. The thick walls had absorbed and released thermal energy throughout the crisis without the expansion and contraction damage that affected thinner construction, while the aerodynamic shape had shed wind loads that stressed rectangular buildings to their breaking points. The transformation in how neighbors approached Anders began with specific technical questions rather than broad philosophical discussions. Jim Talbot, surveying his damaged buildings and calculating repair costs, asked detailed questions about wall thickness, stone selection, and mortar composition. "How thick did you say that wall runs at the base?" he inquired, walking the exterior perimeter with the attention of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. Sarah Nevin wanted to understand the earth berming system, noting how the banked soil around the north and west walls had created wind shadows that protected the structure and prevented the dangerous ice dams that had formed around her own foundation. These conversations led to practical adaptations that appeared across the valley over the following seasons. Talbot commissioned a rounded stone addition to the lee side of his main cabin, creating what amounted to a half-cylinder winter room where his family could retreat during severe weather. The curved wall followed Anders's construction techniques, thick stone, careful mortar work, and integration with earth berming that extended the thermal mass principle to conventional rectangular construction. Sarah Nevin's family took a different approach, adding thick sod berms around their existing frame cabin and installing a double-door airlock system copied directly from the roundhouse design. While they could not change their building's fundamental shape, these modifications reduced wind infiltration and provided the thermal buffering that had proven so effective during the Great Die-Up winter. Their fuel consumption dropped by approximately 20% the following season, demonstrating that even partial adoption of traditional principles could yield measurable benefits. More ambitious projects began appearing throughout the region as word spread of the roundhouse's performance. A rancher 40 miles south built his new barn in a near-circular plan, citing better wind resistance and more efficient use of interior space for hay storage. His design incorporated the same principles of curved walls and earth berming that had protected Anders's house, applied to agricultural buildings where wind damage and temperature control affected both livestock comfort and feed preservation. These local innovations connected to broader patterns that historians would later document across the American frontier. The stone ranch houses built in Carbon and Albany counties during the 1870s and 80s, structures like Bath Ranch with their 18-inch thick native stone walls, represented the same response to harsh climate conditions that had produced earth lodges among native communities centuries earlier. Archaeological evidence from Missouri River sites showed circular dwellings 30 to 60 feet in diameter, earth-bermed and thermally efficient, that had sheltered extended families through prairie winters using principles that European settlement had initially dismissed as primitive. By the 1890s, as territorial Wyoming approached statehood, the round stone house had acquired a reputation that extended beyond the Little Laramie Valley. Engineers working on the Transcontinental Railroad noted its performance during particularly severe storms, and territorial surveyors included detailed descriptions in their reports. Agricultural extension agents began recommending circular or partially circular designs for barns and storage buildings in exposed locations, citing both wind resistance and thermal efficiency. Thomas Krogstad, Anders's son, who had spent the Great Die-Up winter sleeping comfortably in the roundhouse loft while adults managed the crisis below, grew up understanding that his family's home represented engineering rather than eccentricity. As he took over ranch operations in the early 1900s, he continued using his father's construction principles, building additional structures that incorporated curved walls, thick thermal mass, and earth berming. His detailed records, preserved in county archives, documented fuel consumption, repair costs, and comfort levels that consistently exceeded those of conventional buildings. The legacy extended into the 20th century as architects and engineers rediscovered principles that traditional builders had never abandoned. Round homes built for hurricane resistance along southern coasts, earth sheltered houses designed for energy efficiency during the 1970s oil crises, and modern sustainable construction techniques all reflected the same understanding of wind, thermal mass, and building orientation that had informed Anders's original design. Years later, when Thomas Krogstad had grown gray, supervising a ranch operation that included several buildings based on his father's methods, he would tell visitors about the winter when the lighthouse without a light became the only structure in the valley that refused to surrender to the wind. The round stone house still stood, its thick walls storing and releasing heat in the same daily cycles that had sustained 20 people through the worst storm in territorial memory. Proof that the people who survived were those who listened to the land and prepared for conditions that conventional wisdom insisted would never come.